So it is a great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Amit Rakhit and Jeremy Levin from Ovid Therapeutics. So I think they don't really need much of an introduction because they've been with us the longest of anybody in the group. And so we are incredibly grateful to them for obviously many reasons, but the first of which is that they were the first to take a step forward and say, I am going forward to the FDA for a clinical trial in humans in Angelman syndrome. And I do feel that with that step forward, they got people looking and thinking and saying, what's this Angelman syndrome thing and why are people interested in it? And because of that, people started to slowly realize, and actually not slowly, quite quickly, realize that maybe there's something to this Angelman thing, and they brought a lot more people to the table very quickly. So we are very grateful to your company for that. And everyone knows you, so I don't think I need to give much of an introduction. Welcome.
Good evening, everybody. No, it's not yet evening, sorry, it is for me. I've just come back from Israel and I've had the opportunity to meet with the Israel Angelman Society, fantastic. I'm going to say 3 words in Hebrew before I start, and then I'm going to hand over to Amit. חבר'ה, אני יודע שאתם שמה, מזל לכם, זה הכיף להיות איתכם, וככה אני רוצה רק להגיד שאסור שלא היה לי אפשרות להסביר לכם מה שאתם עכשיו שומעים מעמית. What that basically says, I'm very sorry folks, I can't tell you what Amit's going to tell you because we didn't release it until 2 days ago. It is very important for us what Alison just said. We did not get into this with the idea that we would be able to dramatically and immediately affect Angelman. Our job was very simple. It was to create a safe and effective medicine. We're on that journey. And just like Jim said, and I very much appreciated Jim's determination, I watched him as he tried to create the first genetic therapies, and the turn of the century was a bad time, but it took determination. And you've all had determination. And that's what we did. We set out 4 years ago to find the right way of measuring change with a medicine that could affect real clinical change for the first time in human beings who have Angelman. And I'm incredibly grateful for the patience, resilience, determination of the families who joined in us in that journey. I'm also incredibly grateful for the creativity and thoughtfulness of the FDA as they engaged with us to try and get this moving and bring a meaningful medicine with real clinical benefits to everybody. And we're on that journey. We've got ways to go. But what is extremely encouraging, and I think which Amit will now outline for you, is that for the first time ever, there is a real demonstrated clinical impact on individuals with Angelman. And what that means is that we now can move from being in phase 2 into phase 3. So you have to correct that little document, which you showed up front. I did see it. But we are there, and we are going to move along as rapidly as we possibly can. Not only that, Amit will show you that the work we did on adults and adolescents is now going to be able to be worked. We're going to move down in age groups to the little guys. And we're doing it with the same rigor that we did before. I know I'm a stickler for this. Every medicine that you put into somebody's mouth changes the life of that person. And you need to be absolutely sure that it can not only be beneficial, but it has to be safe. So, Amit, I look forward to listening to your presentation. And thank you all for your tremendous patience and perseverance as we join this journey and have joined this journey with you.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for inviting us back again. It's been a great journey. This is our 3rd year back and would like to share with you where we are with the STARS data as well as next steps. So some of you have already heard most of the STARS data before. We've had a few WebEx conferences with the group here, as well as more publicly. And also, you may have seen recently, we announced yesterday that we had our end of phase 2 meeting with the FDA, moving us forward into phase 3. So as you probably saw from Allison's earlier talk this morning, the arrows of everybody moving forward in this space, which is incredible. We can actually move that arrow a little bit further now into a phase 3 program because that's what we're actually embarking on doing. So as I go through this, you may have seen some of these slides before, but what I'd like to do is give you a little context and how this played into what our discussions were with the FDA and what next steps might be. You've seen this before probably too. As you know, Ovid is now a public company, and of course, everything I may say may have some aspirational elements to it. So just to be aware that some of these things may or may not come true in the future, and this is our forward-looking statements as per the SEC guidelines. So this is a quote that we have used actually in our presentations with our external community, specifically people who are interested in Ovid and our investors and our analysts. And this is right from this group here, and this is actually what we've said. Imagine if your child or a loved one could not walk or speak and had a motor impairment, debilitating seizures, and a sleep disorder. This is life today for many people living with Angelman syndrome, and you know this more than anybody else. What we've done now is looking forward in the rare diseases, and I think many of the speakers today have spoken about the challenges of rare disease. But there's a lot of hope in the future, and looking at the pipeline of activities coming forward, specifically in Angelman syndrome, is very, very exciting. But just in general, rare diseases have had lots of challenges because of the time to diagnosis. There are not many or limited therapeutic options, and as you know, there are no indications for Angelman syndrome as a treatment currently available. High costs, as some things have been in the news recently. Little research, but that's improving now, and kind of diverse populations, but that also gives you an opportunity to come together, especially through social media and also global international networks. And if you look at what's happening across the spectrum from 1983 to today, you see that there's been an increase in the number of approvals, and this is specifically for the US and FDA, in the number of approvals that have happened in orphan disease areas. And you can see it's almost like 60 to 70 just in the last year alone. But where are those approvals happening? And over time, the orange bars you see kind of are very predominant. This is oncology. Oncology has been an area where there's been a lot of research and advances, and the FDA division in oncology has been very innovative in its approach. But, and the blue bar that you see that's actually increased, the anti-infectives. Where is neurology? Where is kind of what we're looking at in rare disease and neurology? That's that kind of orange-red bar in the middle there. And over time, it's increasing, but it hasn't increased at a rapid enough pace. And I think when we look at our pipeline that's coming forward, this is going to explode. And with the understanding and the new research that's happening in neurology, this is an area to look forward to and seeing how that might happen in the future. I'm not going to go through too much of the background of Angelman syndrome. There's, suffice to say, there's a significant unmet need here. Most of the therapies we have are symptomatic, and there are some core areas that we focus on. So behavior, motor function, sleep disruption, intellectual ability. And STARS was actually the first clinical trial done by the industry in Angelman syndrome. And here, I think you've done a great job in helping us move forward. And I'll call out for those of you who have participated in STARS, the adherence to not really talking about it on social media has been very good. I think that really helped us with that study. And but now that the study's over, and go ahead. So looking at STARS now, so this is the clinical trial design and baseline characteristics for those of you who are not aware of it. So what we're looking at for STARS is OV101. And this was actually a diagram of what's happening with Angelman syndrome. And this was described earlier today in other presentations, but I'll just mention that what happens is, I think somebody mentioned that one of the proteins that kind of cleans up proteins in the cell doesn't get tagged. And so it sticks around, and then it swoops up all the GABA, or that's intrinsically supposed to be there in the neuronal areas, when that protein should have actually been available, and that kind of the sweeping up protein should have been gone. And so what happens in Angelman syndrome is that you have a lack of GABA available in the extrasynaptic space, where the neurons connect and speak to each other. What OV101 does, now this is one of the downstream therapeutic agents. What OV101 does is actually replace that GABA that's not there. So OV101 is a GABA-specific agonist. What it does is actually behave like if you like GABA. It binds to the receptor that GABA goes to, and it doesn't rely on actual GABA being there, unlike other GABA-type agents. So things like benzodiazepines, things like some of the other GABAergic agents that are out there rely on intrinsic GABA being available, because they're called what's called allosteric modulators. So they kind of enhance the natural GABA's ability to interact with the receptors, while OV101's case, it's differentiated in that way, and it's an actual agonist of the receptor by itself. So let's talk about the STAS study. This was, like I mentioned, the first industry-sponsored clinical trial in Angelman syndrome. We had a 3-arm study where people were randomized to either a placebo group, a once-daily group, or a twice-daily group. And this is a 1-to-1-to-1 randomization. Most of our sites were in the US, with one site in Israel. Ages 13 to 49. As you remember, we started with the older age groups first, and then we opened up to the 13 to 17-year-olds a little bit later in the conduct of the study. And the primary outcome measure was safety and tolerability, but we actually looked at quite a lot of other measures from an exploratory perspective, specifically looking for efficacy or clinical effect. So what we did was we actually scoured the assessments that are available for neurodevelopmental conditions like Angelman syndrome. And what we found that there were a lot of tools available, anywhere from, if you've actually ever seen the box come out for the Baileys, we looked at that. We've looked at the e-diaries. We looked at different scales that are used to measure behavior, such as the ABC scale and the Adams scale. We looked at the child health questionnaire, and they're all listed here. All of them map to a specific domain, whether it's kind of overall function, whether it's just sleep alone, motor function, behavior, or just general quality of life. The reason we looked at all these is because there's no validated scale just meant for Angelman syndrome. In other conditions, for example, Fragile X, they've adapted some of those scales so that they're specific for Fragile X. And there's one thing like the ABC, it has been adapted for Fragile X. But in Angelman syndrome, we didn't have any of that. But we knew that there were symptoms of interest, and we heard that from you. We knew that sleep was an important element of Angelman syndrome, and difficulty going to sleep or waking up multiple times at night was important. We knew that behavior was important. We knew that communication was important. We knew that motor function and being able to walk independently or up the stairs was important. So all of that went into what we looked at for assessments in the STARS study. Now, let's just go through the results, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about what that means in terms of next steps with what we've done with the STARS endpoint, specifically with something called the CGI-I, which I'll go through in a second. So overall, we randomized 88 people who were into the study, and we had and if you ever look at study demographics, which I'm showing you here on your right side of the screen, you just want to make sure the arms are balanced, right? So we had a placebo group, which is sugar pill. We had a once-a-day group, which is that QD middle column. The BID is the twice-a-day group, and then there's everybody all at once. So about the average age was about 23 years of age. You see it's fairly balanced across all those 3 arms. About 60% male, 40% female. Again, fairly balanced across arms. Most people were Caucasian, about 98% were Caucasian in the study. So let's look at kind of the primary endpoint measure. So the primary endpoint, as I mentioned, this is the first time we did an industry-sponsored clinical trial in people with Angelman syndrome. So of course, we want to ensure that safety tolerability is the biggest thing that we look at first. And overall, it's had a favorable safety tolerability and safety and tolerability profile. And what were the most common adverse events, which is what we look for safety and tolerability? Fever, rash, seizures, enuresis, bedwetting, and types of myoclonus or jerking, otitis media is ear infection or viral infection. So just recall that this study happened across November all the way through the January of that following year, about a year and a half. So some of these are associated with infections that you would normally get in the kind of the winter seasons. And overall, there was a fair kind of equal balance of these adverse events. So overall, it's generally well tolerated with few discontinuations. We had 2 people who what we call a serious adverse event. Those are adverse events that require either a hospitalization or more intervention, and these were due to seizures with 2 people who actually, one was not related, had recently changed medications for their seizure treatments, and the other person was also had kind of unstable seizures. And if you recall from the inclusion criteria in the study, you had to have kind of stable seizure activity to come into the study to begin with. And those resolved overall. So let's look at the efficacy endpoints. And what I wanted to talk about is the CGI-I. So the CGI-I is the Clinical Global Impressions of Improvement. What is it? It's basically, if you think about somebody with Angelman syndrome, you may have the same kind of genetic change that's causing the Angelman syndrome, but you may present very, very differently. So the same defect may cause very different kind of manifestations in sleep, communication, motor, behavior, seizures, or other symptoms. And so some people may walk better, yet have issues with sleep, while the same exact defect may cause kind of communications and behavioral changes, but but other things might be fine. And so how do you actually capture that when you're looking at individuals across a spectrum in terms of the entire kind of group that's going to be in this study? Well, the CGI-I is a tool that clinicians use to look at changes in symptoms with each patient individually. So what does that mean? You come into the study at baseline and say, hey, this is kind of what I am. I sleep, maybe 30 minutes a night, and and I can't really walk up the stairs very well. And then we follow that over 6 weeks and 12 weeks to see if there's any changes. And then basically you act as your own kind of control in that space. And so the clinician or the study investigator who is actually assessing can see over time if there's any changes. And what the inputs are basically inputs from the family member, caregivers, of how things have changed at home, from the other potential therapists that are working, occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech therapists, their own interactions and observations, feedback from school, and that's all kind of taken together to form an overall kind of scale of a score. And the score is the CGI-I tool. It's used in a lot of different disease areas. For example, if I was looking in asthma, if I was asthmatic, I would say, look, things I would look at was, am I short of breath? When I walk? Do I have a high respiratory rate? Do I have other things that are related to lung function? And the CGI-I could help me with that, seeing if there was a treatment effect with baseline versus 6 weeks and 12 weeks. Similarly, the CGI-I can be used in other disease areas and typically is used in a lot of neurology or psychiatric studies. And in this study, it's a validated scale. It's a 7-point scale that looks, and it's kind of listed right here. The 4 is no change. 1, 2, and 3 are improved. 5, 6, and 7 are worse. And so it usually captures the totality of symptoms. So if you come in with a baseline assessment at 6 weeks, we would say, okay, where are you given the totality of the information we have? How is your sleep? Or how is whatever your kind of symptom of interest was, how has that been over the last time we saw you? Whether it's sleep, whether it's behavior, whether it's motor. And then we make an assessment on that and give us a score. And then overall together is what we look at for if the score is changing through the different arms of the study, whether it's placebo or the once a day or the twice a day arm. So when we look at that, the CGI-I, we see that the once daily dose actually has a significant effect versus placebo and versus the twice a day as well. So the p-values, if you know statistics a little bit, less than 0.05 is considered statistically significant. And in this case, the once a day arm showed a decrease of approximately, not quite 1 point, but a 0.8 point difference from placebo with a highly statistically significant value of 0.0006. So what does that mean? So that means that the once a day arm actually had a statistically significant improvement on that CGI scale. Remember, the scale is only 7 points, so a 1 point difference can be significant or clinically meaningful. And to give you an example of what a 1 point difference was in this study, so there was, and I think Kelly's not here, but I'll just use her example. So there was an example provided by a mom whose child was in the study and actually talked about pennies in a piggy bank, and was not able to grasp a penny from a table and then put it into a piggy bank with the tiny slit in it. But during the course of the study, was able to pick up not only 1, but 5 consecutively in coins, and is able to put them into a piggy bank. So that translated, at least in this study, into a 1 point difference in the motor score for CGI-I. Another person actually was unable to walk on a treadmill in the past, but then also ultimately was able to, during the course of the study, get onto a treadmill and kind of exercise along with mom, during the course of the study. So was able to walk on a treadmill. There was another person who actually had sleep disorders. And I'll show you in a second that some of the sleep findings were there was about a 25-minute improvement in the time to go to sleep. It was about 10 to 15 minutes. You have to look at, it's a little bit, I'll show you in a second. But there was an improvement in how long the latency to sleep onset. So when you go to bed, how quickly it takes you to go to sleep. And we see that improvement there. And you may say, 10, 15, 20 minutes doesn't seem like a lot. But for somebody who's either headbanging for the most of the time before they go to sleep, or potentially, using their hands and maybe has the potential to put their fist through a window or a wall, that 15 or 20 minutes can be meaningful. And so that's what we see with the study, that there are these different changes that are captured across multiple domains. But the way we've actually totaled all those scores is with the CGI-I score. And this is what we see in the results that have been presented in the past on the different webcasts, as well as what I'm showing you here. And if you look at that a little bit more closely, you can see which scores went to which arm. And again, I remember I said 1 through 7 is the CGI score. What we see here is that, first of all, there was no 1s. There was nobody who had a very much improved, and there were no 7s, very much worse. They were all kind of in between here. And you see that the middle group, 67%, this is the once-a-day arm. These are people who had either a score of a 2 or 3 at the end of study at 12 weeks. This was either much improved or minimally improved. The top line is placebo, so there is a placebo effect, even though it's a little bit less than you see in typical studies of neurodevelopmental studies. Typically, the placebo effect is around 40, as high as 40%. But in this case, it's about, you see improvement in 22% of the placebo arm. And in the twice-a-day arm, you also see some improvement, but not as much as the once-a-day arm. And we do believe that the once-a-day arm is the most effective dose with OV101, where we believe the twice-a-day arm is probably overshooting kind of your sweet spot of where we want to be with the dosing of the compound. Here are some other changes. So when it kind of goes back to all these different pieces that we looked at. Remember I mentioned that we looked at a lot of different assessments: sleep, motor, behavior, communications, and overall CGI, which is global improvement. And we find changes across multiple domains. So CGI-I is the totality, which I've already spoken about. In sleep, we see the latency to sleep onset, approximately a 25-minute difference. And also, if you just ask about sleep and the clinical impressions of sleep, also had a statistically significant difference of improvement. When we looked at motor, we do see trends. These were post hoc analysis. That means they were not pre-specified. And the difference there is if you're pre-specified, I don't know, I haven't seen any of the data. I just kind of say, this is what I'm going to be looking for, and that's what I'm going to find. Post hoc is I've seen the data, and I think I see a clue somewhere else. I'm going to do some more digging and data research. The issue with that sometimes is that if you look at something long enough in multiple different ways, you'll probably find something that seems good. And so that's why post hoc analyses are great for signals and finding trends, but for regulatory purposes, it's typically not used as kind of regulatory filing. You have to pre-specify before you open the envelope. But in the post hoc analyses, we do see changes in motor function, and this is, again, I mentioned examples here would be able to get up from a chair more easily. One person had, anecdotally, was going upstairs one step at a time. You go up one, put the other foot up, and then was able to go alternate up the stairs. Fine motor controls to being able to, I mentioned the penny, but also using a fork for the first time. And so those are some of the things we see with the motor function, which came across in these various domains, the Baileys, the PDCAT, and the CHAC. And then if you were part of the study, we talked about the Zena Walkway, which is a kind of computerized walkway that you would walk across. There again, we did see some reductions in the speed as well as and how fast they kind of walked across that, which implied a little bit trends and improvement on balance and purposeful movements. So those were all very encouraging for us as we looked at it. These are some of the more details around the sleep domains. These are all available on our website if you do take a look, if you wanted these in particular. But not only was the going to sleep improved, but also the total sleep time during the day decreased in the once-a-day arm. So your daytime sleepiness decreased, and that translated into some people saying, look, my child was more awake during school and was able to participate. So that was also seen as part of the study as well. I mentioned the motor functions as well, but let me just go to one more thing before I kind of talk about the next steps of the study. I have a few minutes left. So there was a trend towards younger ages having all ages improved, first of all, between the 13 to 17, 18 to 24, and 25 to 49. But there seemed to be a trend that younger people may have a greater treatment effect with the once-a-day drug. And we saw that in the 13 to 17 years old. We also saw the duration of treatment tended to improve the effect between 6 weeks and 12 weeks. So here's a summary of what we have. So we achieved the primary endpoint of safety and tolerability. We see a kind of an overall statistically significant finding in the global function. So why is that important? Because there is no, remember I said there was no approved assessment tools for Angelman syndrome that have been used for regulatory purposes. And so because we're going into phase 3, we have this opportunity now to really define what would that look like, what is an approvable endpoint in Angelman syndrome. And so with our discussions with the FDA, we made the argument around why CGI-I is an appropriate endpoint. Why? Well, there's no approved assessment tools in Angelman syndrome. It's a very rare, it's a rare condition. There are no treatment options. The CGI-I gives you the totality of information for a symptoms, and when the symptoms are important, many symptoms overlap. So if I had, for example, an improvement in ability to point, that sounds like it's a motor function that's improved with my fine motor. However, if I'm able to point and I point to my iPad device and I'm able to point to what I want to eat, is that something around communication? So how do you separate what's really communication versus motor versus cognition? And so because they're so interrelated, and another example is sleep. If I'm sleeping better through the night and in the morning I'm less sleepy and I'm more aware, maybe I'm less anxious, or maybe my behavior is slightly better. So how do you separate the sleep changes from the behavioral changes? And so because they're interrelated and these symptoms are interrelated, the CGI-I makes sense to have as an endpoint going forward. And that was what our discussion was with this, with the agency. So some things that we have to do before we kind of move forward is make sure everybody's rating the CGI-I in the consistent way across whichever site you're at. So I think that's another piece that we're working on, is the consistency and making sure the training is actually important. I already spoke about the sleep, motor, and the behavior piece, but let me just talk quickly about the next steps for us. So the next step is that once we finalize our protocol, what we propose to the FDA is a study in the 4 to 12-year-old age groups. This is going to be a 2-arm, placebo-controlled, randomized safety efficacy study. Safety efficacy study, which should imply to you phase 3 pivotal trial. So this is the study that we'll use in very similar fashion to what STARS was, but a bit simplified, looking at a once-daily dose. What we've done is, I've shown you some of the data around the once-daily dose. We'll be using that and pulling that forward to the 4 to 12-year-old age group with the anticipated endpoint of the CGI-I based on the most relevant symptoms for Angelman syndrome. What are those relevant symptoms? I think similar to what we've already spoken about, it's about motor function, sleep, behavior, or likely communication. And those are relevant to you as a caregiver or a parent, clinician, and those are the ones we'll be looking at. What's important is to make sure everybody's assessing those points in the same way. And that's our next step, is to make sure that we have that consistency across all the sites and all the raters so that we can do that. And so we're working on that already. There's a team of us here already from Ovid, probably you've seen outside, but we're working on that, and then we anticipate initiating this trial late next year, and pending the recruitment, pending the data, that would kind of set us up for using STARS as a supportive study, and then the Neptune study as our pivotal trial for an NDA filing, which is a new drug application filing for OV101 and the treatment of Angelman syndrome, which we anticipate, keep your fingers crossed, would be finding a clinically meaningful benefit and one of the first treatments on the market for Angelman syndrome specifically. Other things I'll just mention is the ALARA study. I think I'm overset by a few seconds. For those of you who participated in STARS, you are eligible to roll into the ALARA study. That study is an open label, once a day dose. So no matter if you're on placebo or twice a day or once a day, everybody rolls into the once a day arm. It's a 1-year study. The sites that are most close to ready to open are Philadelphia, shortly followed by Chicago, and Phoenix, and San Diego. So that should be happening between now and it's the end of January or so. So if you are involved in any of those sites, just reach out to your clinical investigators or site coordinators at those sites. I think I'm out of time, so I just want to say, I'm going to go right to my hey, we have lots of partnerships. We rely on you and the work you do, and also the work FAST has been a great kind of supporter. The families here have been great to us, and really we're about saving and better lives. So really our collaborations and our partnerships really have given us a voice. Hopefully it's given you a voice. I really appreciate all the support you've given us, and really look forward to working with you moving forward. So thank you very much.
While we are transitioning slides, I think we have time for a couple questions, particularly because Amit is not going to be here for the roundtable, but Jeremy will be, so we'll have the ability to answer questions. So I'm going to change over, maybe just 1 or 2 questions.
Okay. I wondered if you'd had any opportunity to measure GABA-type measures in your trials to see if that correlated with the behavioral changes that you saw.
So we didn't look at kind of GABA plasma levels. We didn't take those specifically, but no, so we haven't looked at that because we didn't do those blood draws.
Thanks. Just a question. Were there any differences in genotype, or were the population sizes small enough that was difficult to look at? And secondly, for the next trial, will recruitment only occur in the US?
So great question. So the genotype, so we enrolled all comers for Angelman syndrome. About 80% were deletion. So there was a very few number of people who enrolled who were either disomy or point mutations. So there's really difficult to tease out because the majority, almost 85% were deletions. In terms of the locations for the next study, we are exploring other countries ex-US. So we do have plans to move to at least start to have interactions with regulatory authorities in Europe, Australia, and Japan. So we'll be kind of providing updates about that, but we are looking ex-US as well. Israel also is already confirmed to be in part of the Neptune study.
Does this work? Oh, it does. Can I ask my question real quick? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for congratulating us old-timers whose people were already in the trial for staying off of social media. We have gotten zero info on what we are supposed to do now about sharing information. And I've already had parents of young people ask me repeatedly today.
Yes.
So advise.
So social media. So initially we wanted people to be off of social media if you're in the study, just so it wouldn't bias people who are already in the study. Now that the study's over, that kind of that recommendation is no longer valid because the study has been completed.
So I can answer any question that a young person's parent asks?
I think in terms of the conduct of the study and your own experiences, that would be fine because the study will be different. That we're going to be starting it'll be a different study, so that'll be okay. Well, somebody did ask me just because you're right there. For other people, ALARA study, the long-term extension, somebody asked me about cannabidiols and if there can be on cannabinoids at all for ALARA. So for ALARA, it's okay. So ALARA is a real-world study for long-term extension. So if you choose to enroll into ALARA, you can be on other, whatever your real-life situation is in terms of meds. And in terms of social media, because we've already closed the STAS study, that study's over. So you can kind of go back to your normal kind of social media communications.
Thank you.
Yes, and for those of us that our children were involved in the study, we haven't received information if our child was part of the placebo, the once a day or the twice a day. Is wondering when we will get that information. Thank you.
Yeah, so great question. So as we start up the ALARA study, one of the things, as soon as you have your baseline visit, if you choose to move into ALARA, that's when you'll let you know. So all site investigators will receive the unblinding codes, but we're just waiting till we start the ALARA study so you can kind of do everything at once. And then they'll be able to inform you about that.
Well, thank you everybody for your wonderful questions. They'll be around at the roundtable as well, so keep your questions written down and you'll have an opportunity to ask them.